63, 64, and 65 are my focus for this next presentation. The slides were intended for 63, 4, 5, and 6, and 7, but we don't have enough time today to go through all those slides, and I decided to kind of minimize the 6 and 7 stuff. So I hope you're not disappointed. We're going to have to do a part 2 of this presentation because these slides were handed out at the National Convention last year. Matt Baltowski brought them back to me, and there's 133 slides. I didn't really email them. Everybody got a thumb drive for each chapter. On the thumb drive was a Excel file with columns 63, 64, 65, and on the left was the area of chassis judging. So you had to read across from 63, 64, is there anything different? If it's blank, that means 63 and 4 are the same. So I took it upon myself to move comments from the Excel file into the slides, and that's why I made the pages you have are called a presenter's view, and that's what I have in my hand to read to you. The notes page in PowerPoint doesn't work with my computer, my projector, so in very tiny letters you can see some of the words that I'm telling you right now. I don't know anybody else in the NCRS who tried to move these comments from Excel into these notes view with PowerPoint. I talked to Mike Hanley in St. Louis about it, and he says, I'm just going to read the Excel file. You're doing too much work. And now that I've encountered this file, I believe he was right. So I'm not done with part 2 by any stretch. And if you have questions about 66 and 67, I'll try to answer them anyway. The focus here was chassis, which is just one of the sections of judging, and configurations and finishes. The pictures say a lot here. I'm sorry that I didn't pay for making color copies for you, but I can give you parts of this file if you need, particular things. I cannot email the whole shebang. Enough about what this is. Let's go to the 1963 Master Cylinder cap. Familiar to most 63 owners, even 63 Impala owners, I think. Notice the thumb screw on the top here. I didn't know, but there's no bleeder screw on a Master Cylinder for most 63 Corvettes. It's supposed to be stove black, and there's a number cast on the bottom shown in the picture on the upper right and shown in your handout. The cap is CAD or zinc plated, and the words used Delco brake fluid kind of circulates around the top of the cap in 1/8 inch letters. That's the kind of detail that's on every page or provided in 2 separate files for every slide in this set. And there started out with 133. I added a couple more for part 1 here. The next slide shows the Master Cylinder caps for 64, which is different, 65, 6, and 7. And you see in the lower right there's a dual reservoir Master Cylinder cap. 64s, like the 63s, had 7/8 inch pistons inside. There's a part number that ends in 264, which is debossed, not sticking out, but stamped on the bottom. The cap is different with a wire bail, and there's instructions on that one too. Notice in 65, they went to a 1-inch bore, and why does it say Bendix? I guess that was the supplier for that Master Cylinder. There's a foam seal between the Firewall and the Master Cylinder, and so on and so forth. 65, if you bought a car with no disc brakes in 65, and I forget how many of those there's leftover 64 stuff. Well, the 64 master cylinder went with that disc brake delete option. Yeah. I've always heard a story about a 65 Corvette with disc brakes and everything else because somebody checked every box on the order sheet.
Drum brake.
And they got drum brakes because they were trying to get every option. For 65, the power brake master cylinder, I'm sorry I don't have a picture of it, but they had nylon or some kind of plastic caps for two separate reservoirs. And the master cylinder was kind of a egg-shaped or oval-shaped thing. These plastic caps turned yellow over time, and I guess the judges are looking for yellow caps rather than the reproduction clear white plastic. It took me a while to figure out what a pi symbol was, but I guess in 65, if you have power brakes, there's actually a round thing that looks kind of like a pi, stamped or debossed into the side of the master cylinder. We're skipping 65 and 67. Let's go to the 63 power brake booster. As Warner said, there's a bolt instead of a thumb screw on the top of the power brake master cylinder. There's also a bleeder screw. Z06 is shown on the right-hand side here, and that's a single reservoir, but a dual piston or dual outlet master cylinder. I have seen one of these. The check valve is this plastic thing over here, and 63 is the only year when it's over on the other side, the outside of the booster, if you will. Next page shows some power brake booster numbers. And be careful when you're studying 64 and 65. There's actually two numbers that end with 11. And each one of these boosters have the last four digits of these part numbers on a tab. That's part of the back piece of the two-part power brake booster. The next slide shows a 64 power brake master cylinder with the J56 option. It's similar to the Z06, has a Julian date and a different part number. The next slide, and I think what we're looking at is this check valve. We know this is not a 63, 64 to 7. The check valve's on the other side of the booster, or what I call inboard, closer to the engine. And I think this photo is a check valve enlarged, and there's some sort of a round symbol stamped in the plastic. So what do these tabs look like with the numbers on them? We go to the next slide, you'll see 342, a Julian date on the side of this booster. Here's a part number derivative, and I think that says 7011 for the 65. There's actually four pictures on this slide. Here's another date down here. Let's move on to steering columns. This is somewhat challenging. There's a picture here of 63, 65, 66, 67 columns. You kind of have to study it, or here's my point in this whole presentation, which is RFM. Read the manual. Because all of this information is in the 6th edition, at least for 63 and 64 and 65. There are more words, and nobody tried to make a summary such as what's in this presentation. So if you're confused by some of these slides, please refer to the manual, which is, in my view, better. If 63, 64 doesn't have as many pictures as the 65, the main plus in these guys, I should have mentioned the names at the beginning. The guys who put this together did an amazing job with the photos and the summary of the information. But I believe that 63 and 64 steering columns were the same.
Okay.
Which is kind of surprising because 63, they changed everything, right? During the course of the year or for the next year. It's semi-gloss black. The support plate is different from the 65. Clamp ring, stamped with an M, and so on. I'm more familiar with the 65. There's a black phosphate clamping ring and a zinc bolt inboard with the head facing up. There's a little tab on a 65 support plate that hooks, a spring attaches for your clutch return. Let's look at the rag joints. It turns out it says natural or paint on 3 different years of rag joints here. And I didn't know this before, but if your steering gearbox, your Saginaw steering gear is painted, then the half of the rag joint that attaches to it should also be painted. At the other end, by the column, should be a natural finish. And so this page shows you a summary of those rag joint differences. Note the comment about telescopic column, both flanges are riveted. I can't, unfortunately, hand out a sample of that, but the tele rag joint is almost totally a different animal too. The spline on a steering column for a 65 has a groove above the spline. I don't see it in this picture.
63 stands alone, but 64 to 6 columns were the same, other than the teles.
When was the earliest year you could get a tele?
65.
Yeah.
5 and 6. And I think those were interchangeable. The 67 had a different one because they started to collapse full columns. And there were 2 different generations of columns in 67.
This is a 1963 steering box with a S for Saginaw on the outboard side. The cover is secured with 3 grade 5 black phosphate bolts and lock washers. I thought it interesting that the cover has a part number on it, except for late production, which has no part number but says check lube. It tells you here how the steering box is affixed to the frame. Inspection marks yellow or green if you have if you have reason to paint your steering gearbox, you paint over those inspection marks. And then somebody's got to look through the paint to see that you got those marks. I don't know how that works. So the 64 steering gearbox is the one that says check lube. It does not look like 65 is different from 64. I think many of you know about the Blackout and the underhood and when A.O. Smith did it and so on. But I want to point out here that 1963, Blackout was done without the hinges on the Firewall, like A.O. Smith did it all the way through 64 to 67. And then they started putting the hinges on and painting them with the Blackout in 64 in St. Louis, not in Ionia, Michigan. So the catches on the Firewall are CAD or zinc with black return springs. There's 2 versions used in 63 and 64. As I said, 63 hood catch goes on the Firewall after the Blackout. The hood pins may have Blackout or even body color on them. See some more slides about Blackout. The low sheen Blackout on the Firewall goes down and hits the top of the heater box, as shown in this picture right up here. And of course the staples, not necessarily stainless or magnetic staples, do get the Blackout because they were already on. The dust shields are tucked into the opening in the A-arm, as you probably know. Let's look at 63 to 65 inner fenders. Here's a picture of a 63. I think your handout's probably looking better than this, but this is kind of curved to go around the corner from the inside the wheel to behind the wheel. 1963, these inner fenders were bonded directly to the upper surround and the side panels in the wheel well. And 63s don't have a provision for a left side hood support. And I mentioned the rounded 64, the top of the fenders, instead of being bonded, they have rubber seals that are stapled to the top edge of the inner fender. And so they just kind of sit up there close to the hood surround underneath. Air conditioned and 396 cars in 65 had the battery on the other side. They made a special cutout in the left side fender well to allow access to the battery. The next page shows an inner fender from 63 to 65. Obviously, there's an air-conditioned car there showing a fuel-injected car with the air cleaner. Again, 1965 foam rubber seals. I don't know why they listed 64 rubber seals and 65 rubber seals separately in this Excel file of information. Again, air-conditioned cars, and I should have said air-conditioned in 396 here. The voltage regulator holes were actually filled in at the factory because the voltage regulator is over on the driver's side for air-conditioned and 396 cars. The next picture shows you inner fenders for 66. There's a much sharper corner here rather than a curve. There's a 67 inner fender. Upper A-arm assemblies are gloss black. Attached to the frame with fine threaded studs. There's a rectangular cross shaft, lock washer, tall hex nut. Something about 3/16 of an inch for the 1963 A-arm bushings, extending beyond the metal cases. I think they're talking about this section, this piece. Notice the shape of the 63, 64 control arm shaft, yeah. That got more rounded in 67, as you can see on the next slide. Cross shaft, they call it. Pretty hard to see up here on the screen, but this is more like a bubble and this is a square. Let's go to front shock absorbers. Rubber grommet, cat or zinc indented washer. All the shocks came from Delco Products in Dayton, Ohio. So 63 Z06 semi-gloss black with blue daubs of paint. 3 and 4 up to serial number 4000 semi-gloss black, and then they became gray. Except for the F40s in 64. 63 front shocks, also black, semi-gloss black. 64 started to go gray after VIN number 4000. Here's the next slide is something I'm a little more familiar with. These splash shields. You can go nuts looking at splash shields and some of the little details. I'm just going to say the smaller triangles fit between the frame and under the battery. There's a 3-ribbed Weatherstrip stapled to the edge, unless you have a Corvette made in 65 after approximately VIN number 13,000. I've read on the discussion board at ncrs.org that there's a few 396 Corvettes with side exhaust where instead of putting the weather strip on, they actually filled in this little divot with a metal piece. There's another splice shield, a bigger one, not for 63, but 64 to 67. They're larger, triangular shape, semi-gloss black, and they're attached to the outboard frame with CAD-plated bolts. Have 3 intersecting lines and integral washers. One side is a little bit different if you have a big block in 65. Let's go to the Blackout again. This time we're looking at the hood for a 63. We talked about 63s. This shows you the area that was covered by the black fiber flap. So with that removed, you can see that that part didn't get painted. Same for the hinge up here. That would be on cars that had the hinges installed at the time of Blackout. It tells you here the bolt head marks. Looks like same as 63 for 1964, except no teeth on the washer. Hood weather strips. I don't know if you've noticed, but 63 and 64 stop over here on the front, or what's really the back edge of the hood. 65 and 67 got wrapped around. And at some point, maybe 67, there's a little plastic pin that holds that wraparound part of the Weatherstrip in place. Let's go to the fan. Notice the part number here, 770529. Same number, right? But when I see something like that, I wonder, who made the fan and how often did they tell Chevrolet that they made changes to the rivets?
Or for air conditioning.
All right, there's a picture of this W on the next slide. And I guess this is on 65 to 67 fans. The rivets change over time, so check your manual and do the right thing when you're restoring. All right, fan clutches. I gather that these two vendors supplied these fan clutches over the period of time that they were used, and there wasn't like before this bin or anything like that. Eaton Fan Clutches had a spiral spring in the middle like that. There's one that you can get today and one that is original. It's a natural aluminum thing with fins on the backside. The shaft is black phosphate. Raised area on the face is a fluid reservoir. It's dated. Both designs have the fan blade installed over 4 black phosphate studs in the clutch body. We'll look at an Eaton fan clutch again. This is a replacement. It's got the coil in the middle, but looks somewhat different. That's for 63 to 65. The Schweitzer in the next slide has a natural cast aluminum, not dated, and the face of Schweitzers have this flat rectangular plate. It's a thermostatic element. CJ black stamp. 65 has a 1.8 inch shaft on the small blocks and 1.5 inch shaft length on the 396 cars. Let's look at a radiator from 63 to 64. Gloss black on aluminum, Harrison radiators. The part number ends in a 316, and there's a year, month date on them. There's some radiator labels. The Harrison aluminum radiator is coupled with an expansion tank. Part number ends in 416. Has a date code on it. The tank was over here. I think you all know approximately where that is on the right side.
Right above the battery.
Yep. Mm-hmm. There's a 63 gas cap in the expansion tank that has a welded nipple. Let's see if I can remember. After mid-64, they started to weld these little tubes. They were cracking and coming loose. The tank is mounted with a steel bracket riveted to the inner fender for 64. 63 straps for this is different. I'm going to cover some radiator caps. The cap for 63 is a model 307. There's an aluminum rivet in the center that has a little divot in the middle of it. And I guess there's quite a few differences between the current reproduction caps and real originals. That shape of that rivet is one of the things. 15 PSI for air-conditioned cars, small block. Expansion tank caps are on the next slide. Notice the colored ink stamp on the stamp. And the date here, I think it says 63D, 2 letters for the year and D for the month. There's a summary on the previous slide of the differences between these caps. But if you look at one of these pictures, yeah, this is an AC radiator cap original, and I don't know how to describe it, but the indentation of the AC and the instructions for how to remove it are more deeply embedded or stamped in a different way than this reproduction. These look like thinner characters all the way through. Okay, I'm going to quickly go over fan, shroud, and core support and try to wrap this up. 63, 4, and 5 all had a metal fan shroud.
Unless they're big blocks.
Unless they're big blocks. 66 and 67 are fiberglass. Good point. They were gloss black, attached to the core support with a certain kind of CAD bolt. They show some head marks in here. A rubber seal fixed with 5 staples inserted from bottom up into the shroud in a 63 fan shroud. This is a metal fan shroud and fiberglass one. Big block, 2 bonded parts make up the big block fiberglass shroud. Fan shroud mounting bolts. There's kind of a unique J-nut here. With the nut is kind of crimped onto the J part of it. 63 to 65 look different than 66 and 67. I'm going to turn it over to you folks, and we'll go through the rest of these slides, and maybe there's questions about what is said for the core support. What is this thing sitting down here? Looks to me like a C1 headlight bucket. Oh, there is an interesting little NCRS thing about the support rods. This is viewed from the engine side, but there were changes in these radiator supports involving how those rods were attached. Let me wrap it up and let me do the horn stuff. Here's some part numbers for horns that attach to the radiator support on the front side. There's a left and a right part number, and they're all, well, most of them are dated, year, month, and week. In 65, the harness is on top of the headlight support braces. A single green wire from the horn relay is attached with black phosphate clip to core support, runs down the passenger side. Here's some 63 horns, and the location of these part numbers, I think they're just extensions of a 9000 or something, aren't they? All the horns were made with 9000, and then they were stamped for 455 or 456, and the date was added. This is a Delco Remy product. 64 and 67, the part number changed, and they were dated and stamped in a similar fashion. 64 to 67, they're pointing down. This part is obviously the opening of the trumpet. There's a little bit about headlight motors at the end here. For 1963, they're natural steel, cast alloy housing, cast aluminum bracket, white plastic. To me, a mid-year headlight motor is pretty much a headlight motor, but I learned that the plastic where the wire plugs in is a different color on some of them. It's called the female wire harness receptacle, black, and then white in 64. They're all dated. When you're putting a black ground wire on, you want to do the motor, the bracket, the star washer, the ground wire, and the bolt on top. So that's kind of the stack up for that. One more slide says thank you.